Let us bow in prayer. Gracious and life-giving God, your creative presence is at work each moment of each day, bringing life. Your eternal love is always near, seeking to draw us closer and closer to your heart. Help us to be open to your closeness each day. Help us to be open to you in a special way these next few moments, and may you be pleased to use my words, all of our thoughts, all of our meditations, that through them and in spite of them, we might be drawn closer to you and gain an added measure of your truth and of your love. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen. When I was a kid, one of my favorite things was coming home off the bus after school and walking into the house and realizing that it had been a baking day for my mother. The whole house was filled with the wonderful aroma of freshly baked bread, amongst other things. And then the next most wonderful thing was being invited to have a snack before supper, which involved a fresh bun with butter or jam on it. Nothing was so good, and I can still smell and taste that sensation today. Probably, for many of you, you have similar memories as well of your homes from your childhood. For much of Western society, bread is considered the staple of life. It's the smell, the taste of bread signifies all the goodness of life. Bread represents the gift of life itself, the joy, the abundance, and the satisfaction of life itself, where our hungers are filled and we feel safe at home. Well, today we have a very familiar passage written by John the Gospel writer involving bread, which Tom read for us. It is the feeding of the 5,000, a miracle story. Now, miracles in the Bible were amazing stories that showed God's presence, but what was always more important was not the miracle, but the teaching that the miracle gave. So for ancient ears and for modern ears, the question today is not how did Jesus feed 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish, due to the generosity of a little boy with 12 baskets full of leftovers and everyone satisfied. That's not the question. The question is, what does this mean for us today? What is the teaching from this miracle that makes sense for modern people in a modern context? Well, the importance of the miracle story stands out for us today when you realize that all the gospel writers chose to include this story in their gospel. This is the only miracle story recorded by all 4 gospel writers. So you say, oh, this one has particular significance. So let's look at the story. The feeding of the 5,000 starts out by showing us the problem. Crowds are coming to Jesus. They want to see miracles, they want to see signs, they want to see wonders of God's presence. Now, the crowd is like any crowd. They do not necessarily believe in Christ as the Messiah. They do not necessarily want to become his followers or take on the demands of living as Christ lives. Some will want help, some want a spectacle, and others are there because they like excitement. This doesn't mean the crowds don't have legitimate needs. They are poor and they need help in a world that saw them as unimportant. They desire hope, for life could be hard. Think about the life they would have had. When there was a drought or a disaster with the harvest, people starved. When children were born, like in modern times, amongst the poorest of the world's poor, many would die before the age of 5 due to childhood diseases, which we can treat now, but they couldn't then. They lived at the whim of powerful political, military, economic, and religious forces that sought to control their lives for the benefit of the powerful. Their homes, their livelihood could be eliminated by a powerful governor. Their able-bodied men could be arrested on the slightest charge, maybe never to be seen again. They could be victims of conflict and violence that could erupt at any moment. Well, today in our modern world, many also live in times of legitimate need. There are many who are poor and struggle to make ends meet, to pay for medications, to keep a roof over their heads, to help their children receive an education, find a meaningful career, earn enough to have a good life. There are many in our world who struggle with sickness or disease, and there are many who live in homes filled with abuse, or live in neighborhoods or communities racked with crime or gang violence in particular. There are others who live in war zones, forced to flee for their lives, trying to find safety in some place that will take them in. And then there are others, often because of the color of their skin, their religion, their ethnicity, are subject to prejudice and racism, that takes away from life. There are great needs today, just like the crowds of old in this story. And in this miracle story, one of the greatest needs, of course, the present one, is hunger. It's a physical hunger because it is late. They are far from town where food could be found. And we already know they have a spiritual hunger because that's why they've come to see Jesus. How many people in our country have physical hunger these days? There are many who use food banks to make it each month. This includes many who are working full-time, as well as those who live on assistance or live off the streets with no support. Even in rural areas, we have many people who have food hampers through the year, given out to them when they find themselves in periodic trouble, such as when a job layoff happens, or when a marriage ends, or when an unexpected bill like a furnace breakdown threatens the grocery budget. But there's also deep spiritual hunger that threatens many modern people as well. See, whenever we feel alone, forgotten, or isolated, whenever we are filled with fear, with no sense of hope or direction, whenever we live with a discouraging outlook that says life cannot be good, then we are experiencing a spiritual hunger that's devastating. So in the face of realities in our modern world that mirror those realities of the crowds of long ago who flocked to Jesus, what can we learn from this miracle of feeding the 5,000? First of all, the story from John tells us that Jesus doesn't just see a crowd of faces. He sees people with particular needs. He sees people with hunger. And so if you think about it, it's Jesus who first asks the question, how will we feed these people? We live in a world where people are often seen as statistics, treated as numbers or consumers rather than real people. The passage tells us that in Christ we are seen as real people, not just a faceless crowd. Secondly, the miracle story shows us that Jesus involves the disciples in answering the need of hunger, because he starts by asking them, what should we do? So we hear the conversation. Philip says, well, even if they were able to find a place to buy bread, it would cost 6 months' wages to feed this crowd and give them even a little taste. Andrew says, he searched the crowd, and he's only found 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish that a little boy is willing to share. And then Andrew says, but what good is that in the face of such need? We too often feel overwhelmed by the needs of our world and the suffering of people near and far. We, like the disciples, often feel paralyzed, unable to make a difference. But in the story, Jesus has a different idea. And so thirdly, the miracle story shows us Jesus who acts in faith. He gets the people to sit down. Jesus then blesses the little they have, bread and fish. He shares it with the people. In other gospel accounts, they describe how he gets the disciples to do the work of distribution. It's a reminder that Jesus chooses to act through us, to empower us to live the love of God that will make a difference in the lives of many. And then fourthly, the power of the miracle is shown when we are told that all are fed and satisfied. Then they gather up the leftovers, a total of 12 baskets full. God is the God of abundance, this passage teaches. There is enough for all. No one has too much, and no one has too little. All have enough. All hungers are satisfied, we're told. And then finally, we see that the people misunderstand the meaning of the miracle because they want to make Jesus king by force. And by making him king, they are in effect making him theirs to control. But Jesus resists the idea, goes away by himself to the mountains to pray. The point of Jesus resisting the crowd's desire to make him king is that we cannot contain God. We cannot limit Christ to be at our beck and call like a magic genie to answer our whims and desires or needs. Jesus comes amongst us, rather, as the embodied love of God. Not to serve us like a magic genie, but to call us, to transform us and the world, to embrace us with love, so that the dream God intends for this earth, a dream where hungers are satisfied, where love is known fully, and where life overcomes all suffering and death, that becomes a reality in our lives and in our world. The miracle shows us that when Jesus comes amongst us, he, like then, shows us the hungers of the world, invites us to join him in answering those hungers, and gifts us with the hope, vision, and love that will bring new life. The miracle reminds us that we are invited to answer the call of Christ, to join him in the ministry of new life. We are called to worship God, to honor Christ, but at the same time embark on the great adventure of being the hands and feet, heart and voice of Christ in the world today. The passage also shows us something that's very important for modern people in the church and in the community in our Western world particularly. In our modern time, we often live in what people call an attitude of scarcity. We as a modern society collectively have more things than any previous generation. We have more food, we have bigger homes, we have more money, we have more gadgets, we have more technology, we have more transportation and communication abilities and opportunities than anyone else in the history of the earth. But we also may have more fears, more longing for things to satisfy our deepest hungers than other generations. We are more afraid of not having enough. We look at the world around us, at our lives, at our churches, at our communities, and we can name why something can't be done. We can name why we will never have enough money to do something important. We can name our scarcity, but hardly ever see our abundance. This miracle story shows us the heart of Jesus, who looked at scarcity, 5 loaves and 2 fish. He looked at a need, a hungry crowd, and responded by faith. Now, the faith was not saying, God, do something about this. The faith was, God, thank you that we are here. God, thank you for what you have provided. And so in faith, Jesus and the disciples acted to share the food they had. That's when the miracle took place. When they went from thinking about what they didn't have and how they couldn't do something to acting and trusting God to be with them as they did something, as they used what they had and did what they could to start feeding people. Following the example of one little boy who had a generous heart and shared his lunch. I read one of the commentators on the biblical passages this week I read. Her name was Cheryl Bridges Johns, and she writes this some phrases here. She says, in 1946, when Mother Teresa came face to face with the masses of suffering and dying in Calcutta, she experienced what she called the call within the call, namely to serve those suffering the most. She began the Missionaries of Charity, a small order of 13 members. In the ensuing decades, the order grew to thousands of members giving care in many orphanages and charity centers. If you think about it, if she had looked with the eyes of scarcity, nothing would have been done. Miracles of love would never have happened. The miracle of today's story is about what happens when we who have nothing, or feel we have nothing, offer to Christ in love and gratitude what we have. Our faith, our helpfulness, our willingness to learn and grow, our generosity and our compassion. What happens is a miracle in which hunger is satisfied for thousands. Let us be a people who in faith and hope look to Christ, not with eyes that see only the scarcity and hungers of the world, but the abundance of God's grace and love surrounding and filling us. May we become a church that trusts so much in God's love that we act always with compassion and generosity, trusting the little we offer in faithfulness becomes the much of God's abundance. Amen.